They walked in First Nations and walked out assimilated. For over a century, First Nations children were stripped from their families and forced into a new world. No longer allowed to practice their beliefs and speak their language, these children were aggressively assimilated into the Western ideologies. One of the darkest and most unrecognized periods in Canadian history occurred at the door of the residential schools. Enacted in 1867, the Indian Act gave the Canadian government control over many aspects of the lives of First Nations. One major part of this act was the eventual creation of Indian residential schools. In the 1860s, under the rule of Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Indian residential schools under the Canadian government opened to assimilate First Nations peoples. It has been strongly impressed upon myself, as head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. The first residential schools opened in the 1860s, and the number of schools generally increased over the years. The peak of residential schools occurred in the 1930s, with approximately 80 schools open across Canada. At as young as 4 years old, First Nations children were taken from their families and brought to residential schools to be taught a new way of life. The main goal of the schools was assimilation, but many believed that the Canadian government had another plan in mind.
The goal of the schools was a part of an overall plan to get rid of us, not assimilate us, to get rid of us.
The schools were funded by the government but run by various churches. In the residential school system, children were taught how to speak, read, and write in English and were no longer allowed to speak their mother tongue. Students were given new names and were not to be called by their Indian names. The students were forced to learn the Catholic religion and forget about their own cultural beliefs. Any infractions would lead to severe physical punishment. The entire residential school experience was traumatizing for the children. Many forms of abuse took place within the walls of each residential school. Physical and sexual abuse, such as beating, whipping, and molesting children, were prominent in a large majority of schools across the country. Schools were even known to use the First Nations children at residential schools for scientific testing.
Okay, so my school was one of the first ones, and it stayed open till 1970. So I know that my school was pretty good as far as maintenance and health, safety, things like that. But there were many schools that weren't very safe for the children. And when the different people would complain to the government in Ottawa, the government didn't do anything.
Along with all of this abuse was often unsafe living conditions, poor food quality, absence of adequate health care, and in many cases, the students suffered from malnourishment and disease.
We were hungry constantly. I became a table captain, so I had to dish out the food to the kids in my table. And quite often I never got enough to eat myself because I ended up by giving too much to one or two of the kids. And we used to go, like, Nimkis River was right across, only a few miles away. And we used to go drag seining there for sockeye in the spring. But they never fed us one sockeye. It was used for trade, for other things. We never ate our own food in the school. All we ate was the junk that they gave us.
Do you remember what it was?
Oh, yeah, all junk. For breakfast we had porridge, but there was maggots in the porridge. We used to kid each other about that.
By the 1950s, the Canadian government began to realize that the assimilation was not working, and the devastating effects of the residential schools were becoming more widely known. The residential school system began to dissolve, and in 1996, the very last residential school closed in Saskatchewan. With residential schools operating for over a century, the effects on the First Nations populations was unimaginable. An approximate number of 150,000 First Nations children were sent to residential schools at some point. Of these 150,000 children, it is estimated that nearly 6,000 of them died in the residential school. In comparison, a soldier entering World War II would have greater chance of survival than a First Nations child entering a residential school. Of the 6,000 First Nations children who died, nearly 1/3 of them never even had their name and death recorded. There were many other effects associated with residential schools. Many people who left the schools were unable to deal with the emotional and psychological pain they suffered from their residential school experience and often turned to drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism. Many people had a lot of anger built up as well from the traumatic experiences that they and their friends and family endured as a result of the residential school system.
In terms of the community, residential school has impacted the whole community in lots of different ways. And I think one of the things is the anger. There's a lot of anger in our communities, and I think it stems directly from residential schools. Although I never attended residential school myself, when people came back from residential schools, they had a lot of anger.
The residential schools had a huge impact on First Nations families. Children being taken from their families for such long periods of time to attend residential schools often caused a disconnect in the family unit.
When I got out of school, the government had charge over us from 5 to 16, our education. So their method being to put us into residential school, so I was cut off during those times. And so I had to stay there till I was 16, and I had finished high school, so I went right to Detroit and tried to live with my mother. And it's like living with a total stranger. So I moved out within a couple of weeks and lived on my own for a couple of years before I got married. Now, when I got married, I was still young. I was just before 19 years of age, and I didn't know how to be a parent. I didn't know how to warm a baby bottle. My sister-in-law was just a baby then, and I warmed her bottle and she handed it back to me and she said, "Hot." And I thought, here's this little baby that can barely talk, telling me how to be a parent. And so, and I didn't even know how to cool it off. And I think of all of the things through life that are an impact of going to the schools. I was 30.
Due to the aggressive assimilation of residential schools, a detachment occurred in First Nations culture, which is especially seen in the loss of language.
That's entitled, Everything You Need to Know for Life You Learn in Kindergarten. And it's so true that at that age, you're exploring the world, and you're learning about the world. And here they are taking us from the world that we existed in, which was just fine. We had a teaching method and learning method, and put us in an entirely different one where I was cut off with the language. So I believe that was important, that I'm no longer able to speak my language. I believe that our value system was changed at that time, and I believe that is really important in the way we are now.
The impact that residential schools had on First Nations culture has led people to start considering this part of Canadian history as a cultural genocide.
One of the big things that bothered me was they called it cultural genocide. And I'd never ever heard that term, cultural genocide, applied to anybody. Why is it cultural genocide against First Nations, but genocide against Rwandans? What's the difference? And the difference is that the society can't bear the fact that they came from a group that wanted to get rid of the Indians. Period. It was genocide. It was an attempt at genocide.
The Canadian government finally began to recognize the devastating effects that residential schools had and the effects that are still present to this day. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper finally released a formal apology to First Nations on behalf of the Government of Canada.
Therefore, on behalf of the Government of Canada and all Canadians, I stand before you in this chamber so vital, so central to our existence as a country, to apologize to Aboriginal peoples for the role the Government of Canada played in the Indian residential schools system.
Currently, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is a component of the Indian Residential School Agreement, is releasing a report about the conditions and impacts of residential schools, as well as a number of recommendations for the Canadian government to implement in order to move towards reconciliation. Many people across the country are completely unaware of Canada's history and involvement with residential schools, and it is believed that education is the first step in the process of reconciliation.
How often do you come across people that are completely unaware of residential schools?
Honestly, probably daily. I run into somebody that they'll hear the news reports, or they'll know that there was residential schools, but that's as much as they know.
What?
Do you know what residential schools are?
I don't know anything.
It's like when the government thought that the First Nations weren't suited to be parents, then they brought the kids.
They stole the kids.
They stole them to residential schools where they were like beaten.
And basically like child slaves.
Nothing much, really.
I don't know anything about residential schools.
All I know is like it was when the native children were taken away from their families and like put in schools where they had to unlearn their culture.
It's a school near residential areas.
I know nothing.
Isn't that where... Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
One student, and I, couldn't remember his name, but I said that he was part of a class who were working on a project, and they felt like they were actually cheated out of a part of their own history. And so what else are they being cheated on,